In the pale glow of gaslight, dust particles danced like specters through the air of Blackwood Manor. Outside, a fierce autumn storm raged against century-old stone walls, while inside, the grand ballroom stood prepared for an event that had once been annual tradition. It was November of 1903, and tonight marked the first autumn ball the manor had hosted in nearly 20 years. The once magnificent Blackwood Manor perched atop the highest hill in Ravenshire County, its Gothic spires piercing the perpetually gray skies like accusatory fingers. Time and neglect had not been kind to the estate. The gardens had grown wild, the paint had peeled, and local children whispered tales of ghosts wandering the grounds at night. But tonight, the manor would reclaim a spark of its former glory. Eleanor Caldwell adjusted her pearl earrings before the ornate mirror in the guest chamber, her fingers trembling slightly. At 20 years old, this would be her formal introduction to society, a delayed debut due to her father's recent passing and the subsequent year of mourning. Her gown of ivory silk caught the candlelight, transforming her into a vision of ethereal beauty. Her chestnut hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement of curls, with a few tendrils left artfully loose to frame her face. "You look absolutely breathtaking," her Aunt Vivian declared from the doorway, her own formal attire a deep midnight blue that complemented her silver-streaked hair. "Your mother would have wept to see you tonight." Eleanor smiled wistfully. "I wish she could have been here." "She is, my dear. In your grace, your kindness, your every gesture." Vivian approached, adjusting one of Eleanor's curls with maternal tenderness. "Now, there's someone I'd like you to meet this evening. The son of an old acquaintance, a young doctor who's recently returned from his studies in London." Eleanor sighed. "Aunt Vivian, I've told you I have no interest in—" "Nonsense," Vivian interrupted with a dismissive wave. "William Hargrove is a fine gentleman of excellent standing. His family has connections to Blackwood Manor that stretch back generations." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "In fact, his grandmother was once engaged to the old master of Blackwood himself, before the tragedy, of course." "What tragedy?" Eleanor's curiosity was piqued despite her reluctance about the introduction. "Later, dear. Our carriage has arrived." The journey to Blackwood Manor took them along a winding road through dense woods. Eleanor watched raindrops race down the carriage window, her thoughts drifting. When the manor finally came into view, illuminated by flashes of lightning, she felt an inexplicable chill despite the warmth of her velvet wrap. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Vivian remarked, misinterpreting her niece's shiver as excitement, though not as grand as it once was. "The current owner, Mr. Richard Blackwood, is the last of his line. He's finally reopened the manor for social events after decades of seclusion." "Why such isolation?" Eleanor asked, unable to tear her gaze from the imposing silhouette of the manor. Vivian hesitated. Old wounds, family sorrows, the usual afflictions of ancient bloodlines. The carriage came to a halt before the entrance, where footmen waited with large umbrellas to escort guests inside. Eleanor stepped into the grand foyer, momentarily overwhelmed by the opulence that surrounded her. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors. Tapestries depicting mythological scenes adorned the walls. A magnificent staircase swept upward in a graceful curve, its banister polished to a mirror shine. Dozens of guests in their finery mingled throughout the space, their laughter and conversation creating a pleasant hum beneath the delicate notes of a string quartet positioned in the corner. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Caldwell, how delightful you could attend." The voice belonged to a distinguished man approaching them with measured steps. In his early 60s, Richard Blackwood carried himself with the rigid posture of one accustomed to authority. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his black evening attire impeccable. Yet there was a weariness in his eyes that his cordial smile couldn't quite disguise. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you for the invitation," Vivian replied warmly. "May I present my niece, Eleanor Caldwell?" Eleanor curtsied as she'd been taught. "It's an honor to be welcomed into your beautiful home, Mr. Blackwood." "The honor is mine, Miss Caldwell." He bowed slightly. "You bear a striking resemblance to your mother. She and your father attended many gatherings here in their youth." Eleanor brightened at this connection to her parents. Did they truly? Mother never mentioned it. A shadow seemed to pass over Mr. Blackwood's features, but it vanished so quickly, Eleanor wondered if she had imagined it. "Indeed, your mother was quite the accomplished pianist. Perhaps you inherited her talent." There was something in his tone, a hopeful inquiry that seemed weighted with more significance than casual curiosity. I play a little, though nowhere near mother's level, I'm afraid. Nevertheless, I would be delighted to hear you play sometime. The pianoforte in the music room was your mother's favorite. He gestured toward the ballroom. Please, enjoy yourselves. The dancing will commence shortly. As Mr. Blackwood moved to greet other guests, Vivian steered Eleanor toward the refreshment table. Richard seems in better spirits than I anticipated, she murmured. This is the first time he's hosted an event since his wife and daughter passed. How terrible, Eleanor said. When did this happen? Oh, many years ago. Consumption took them both within months of each other. Young Catherine would have been about your age now. Vivian's expression brightened suddenly. Ah, there's Dr. Hargrove. Come, Eleanor. Across the room stood a young man engaged in conversation with an elderly couple. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of burnished copper and a neatly trimmed beard, he cut an impressive figure in his formal attire. Dr. Hargrove? Vivian called as they approached. How wonderful to see you again. He turned, revealing a face that Eleanor reluctantly admitted was quite handsome. Strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes of such a deep blue they appeared almost violet in the gaslight. Mrs. Whitmore, he greeted Vivian warmly before his gaze settled on Eleanor. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. May I present my niece, Miss Eleanor Caldwell? Eleanor, this is Dr. William Hargrove. Miss Caldwell. He recovered his composure and bowed. Your aunt has spoken of you often, though her descriptions failed to do you justice. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. How unfortunate that she's spoken of me at all, as it places me at a distinct disadvantage. You know of me, while you remain a mystery. A smile curved his lips. No great mystery, I assure you. Just a country doctor recently returned from London, where I specialized in the treatment of respiratory ailments. Dr. Hargrove has taken over his father's practice in the village, Vivian added. His modern methods have already earned him quite a reputation. You flatter me, Mrs. Whitmore, William replied, though his eyes never left Eleanor's face. Miss Caldwell, would you do me the honor of the first dance? Eleanor hesitated. There was something about Dr. Hargrove that unsettled her, not unpleasantly, but in a way that made her feel as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, about to step into the unknown. I would be delighted, she found herself saying. The orchestra began to play, and guests moved toward the ballroom. Eleanor placed her gloved hand in Dr. Hargrove's, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The ballroom was the crown jewel of Blackwood Manor, a vast space with a ceiling painted to resemble the night sky, complete with constellations picked out in gold leaf. Massive mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the light of the chandeliers and creating the illusion of endless space. As William placed his hand at her waist and began to guide her through the waltz, Eleanor was struck by a peculiar sensation, as though she'd danced with him before, in this very room. You're quite light on your feet, Miss Caldwell, he remarked. As are you, Dr. Hargrove. One wouldn't expect a physician to be so accomplished at dancing. He chuckled. My mother insisted on proper instruction. She believed a doctor should be as dexterous on the dance floor as he is in the surgery. They moved in perfect synchronization, as if they'd been dance partners for years rather than minutes. Eleanor found it easy to converse with him, their dialogue flowing naturally from topic to topic. Literature, music, his experiences in London, her life in the countryside. Have you ever visited Blackwood Manor before tonight? He asked as they executed a particularly complex turn. No, never. Though apparently my parents attended gatherings here years ago. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or concern. Your parents were acquainted with the Blackwoods. So it seems. Mr. Blackwood mentioned that my mother used to play the pianoforte here. William's grip on her waist tightened almost imperceptibly. Interesting. My grandmother was once engaged to Thomas Blackwood, Richard's father. Yes, Aunt Vivian mentioned that. What happened? She chose my grandfather instead. From what I understand, it created quite the scandal at the time. The music swelled and they fell silent, lost in the rhythm of the dance. Eleanor glanced at their reflection in one of the massive mirrors and froze mid-step. Where there should have been two figures, hers and William's, there were distinctly three shadows cast upon the far wall. William noticed her distraction. Miss Caldwell, are you unwell? The shadows, she whispered, not wanting to draw attention from other dancers. Look at the wall behind us. He turned slightly, maintaining their dance posture. His expression revealed nothing, but she felt his pulse quicken where their hands were joined. A trick of the light, perhaps, he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Eleanor stared at the wall. Two shadows moved in perfect harmony, clearly hers and William's, while a third shadow, taller and somehow more substantial, stood perfectly still between them. "Do you see it?" she pressed. He hesitated. "Yes, but we shouldn't cause a scene. Let's continue dancing until the music ends." They completed the waltz, though Eleanor's enjoyment had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of unease. As the final notes faded, she looked again at the wall. All three shadows bowed in perfect unison, though she and William had made no such movement. "I need some air," she whispered urgently. William nodded, leading her from the dance floor toward a set of French doors that opened onto a covered terrace. Outside, the storm had diminished to a gentle rain, and the cool air was a welcome relief from the warmth of the ballroom. "What did we just witness?" Eleanor asked once they were alone. "I'm not certain," William admitted, "though Blackwood Manor has always been rumored to have peculiarities." "Ghosts, you mean?" "I don't believe in such things. Nor did I until my recent return." He gazed out at the rain-slicked gardens. "Since taking over my father's practice, I've heard stories from patients. Respectable, rational people who claim to have seen or experienced inexplicable things on the Blackwood estate." "What sort of things?" "Figures in the woods, music playing from the manor when it was supposedly empty, lights in windows of unused rooms." He turned to face her. "And there's a particular tale about the ballroom, that during the last autumn ball held here 20 years ago, a tragedy occurred that led to the manor being closed to society until now." Eleanor shivered, drawing her wrap tighter around her shoulders. "What tragedy?" "A young woman died or disappeared, depending on which version of the story you hear. Some say she was in love with Thomas Blackwood, despite his being married at the time." "Your grandmother's former fiancé?" William nodded. "The same." A soft cough interrupted them. They turned to find Mr. Blackwood standing in the doorway. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Hargrove, your expertise is needed. Mrs. Lancaster is experiencing difficulty breathing." "Of course." William bowed to Eleanor. "Excuse me, Miss Caldwell. I hope we may continue our conversation later." Left alone with their host, Eleanor felt suddenly awkward. "I should return to the ballroom. My aunt will be wondering where I've gone." "A moment, if you please." Mr. Blackwood's tone was gentle but commanding. "You saw something during your dance with Dr. Hargrove, did you not?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to respond without sounding fanciful. "I may have imagined it." "Three shadows, perhaps? When only two should have been cast?" She stared at him, startled by his accuracy. "Yes. How did you know?" "Because I've seen them too. Every night for the past month as I walk the halls of this house." He approached, his footsteps silent on the stone terrace. "Miss Caldwell, would you think me mad if I told you I believe my home is trying to communicate with me?" "Not mad, sir. Perhaps mistaken?" A sad smile touched his lips. "So diplomatic. You remind me of her in that way as well." "Of whom?" "Your mother, of course." Lily was always careful with her words. The use of her mother's given name struck Eleanor as oddly intimate. "You knew my mother well?" "There was a time when I knew her better than anyone, before she married your father." His gaze drifted to the rain beyond the terrace. "She was supposed to play the pianoforte at the last autumn ball, but she never arrived." Before Eleanor could inquire further, Vivian appeared in the doorway. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." She nodded respectfully to Mr. Blackwood. "I hope my niece hasn't been monopolizing your time, Richard." "Not at all. We were just discussing her mother's musical talents." His expression shifted seamlessly back to that of the cordial host. "If you'll excuse me, ladies, I must attend to my other guests." As he departed, Vivian gave Eleanor a questioning look. "What was that about?" "I'm not entirely sure," Eleanor replied truthfully. "Aunt Vivian, did Mother ever mention being particularly close to the Blackwood family?" A strange expression crossed Vivian's face. "Why do you ask?" "Mr. Blackwood spoke of her with such familiarity." "Your mother was acquainted with many prominent families before her marriage." Vivian's tone was dismissive in a way that immediately aroused Eleanor's suspicion. "Come, the next dance is about to begin, and I've promised you'll partner with Lord Pembroke's son." Throughout the remainder of the evening, Eleanor found herself distracted. She danced with various partners, including the dull but well-meaning Pembroke heir, yet her thoughts continually returned to the three shadows and Mr. Blackwood's cryptic comments. William Hargrove did not seek her out again, though she occasionally caught him watching her from across the room as he attended to his duties as the evening's unofficial physician. Once, their eyes met, and she could have sworn he subtly gestured toward a door partially hidden behind a decorative screen. When Vivian was engrossed in conversation with old acquaintances, Eleanor seized her opportunity. She slipped away from the ballroom, finding herself in a dimly lit corridor lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, warm light spilling from within. The music room. Eleanor entered cautiously. A magnificent pianoforte occupied the center of the space, its polished surface reflecting the light from a nearby lamp. The walls were lined with shelves of sheet music and musical instruments in glass cases. "I wondered if you would find your way here." She spun around to find William closing the door behind him. "Dr. Hargrove, you startled me." "My apologies." He approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "After what we witnessed in the ballroom, I thought you might seek answers." "This room holds many of them, I believe." "What do you know that you're not telling me?" Eleanor demanded. "It's not my story to tell, but I can show you something that might help." He moved to the pianoforte, lifting the lid to reveal the keys. "Do you recognize this instrument?" Eleanor drew closer, running her fingers lightly over the ivory keys. "Should I? Look here." He pointed to a small engraving on the inside of the lid, two sets of initials intertwined, LM and RB. "LM," Eleanor whispered. "Lily Montgomery, my mother's maiden name. And RB, Richard Blackwood," William confirmed. The realization struck like lightning. They were involved? More than that. They were engaged to be married. Eleanor sank onto the pianoforte bench, her mind reeling. "But that's impossible. My mother married my father in 1882. I was born the following year, and the last autumn ball at Blackwood Manor was held in 1883. William sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "The night your mother was supposed to announce her engagement to Richard Blackwood. But she never came." Eleanor recalled Mr. Blackwood's words. "Because she had already married my father and was possibly already with child." She looked up at William, a terrible thought occurring to her. "The shadow we saw, could it have been?" A creak of floorboards interrupted her. They both turned to see Mr. Blackwood standing in the doorway, his face pale in the lamplight. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said stiffly. "Dr. Hargrove, Mrs. Lancaster is asking for you again." William rose. "Of course." He glanced at Eleanor, an unspoken message in his eyes. "Be careful." Once William had gone, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Mr. Blackwood remained by the door, regarding Eleanor with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You know, don't you?" he finally said. "About your mother and me." Eleanor nodded, unable to find her voice. He crossed to a cabinet, removing a crystal decanter and two glasses. After pouring a small measure of amber liquid into each, he offered one to Eleanor. "I'm not in the habit of serving spirits to young ladies, but I think this conversation warrants an exception." She accepted the glass but didn't drink, watching as he took a seat in an armchair opposite the pianoforte. "Lily and I grew up together," he began, his gaze distant. "Our families' estates adjoined one another. We were inseparable as children, and as we grew older, that friendship blossomed into something deeper. We planned to announce our engagement at the autumn ball of 1883, but she married my father instead," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes, James Caldwell, a man 15 years her senior, with wealth and connections far beyond what my family could claim at that time." Bitterness tinged his voice. "A week before the ball, I received a letter from her, breaking our engagement. No explanation, just regrets and apologies. You must have been devastated." "I was, but nothing compared to the shock of reading the marriage announcement in the newspaper the very day of the ball." He took a sip of his drink. "I canceled the ball, of course, closed the manor to society. My parents urged me to move on, to find another suitable match, but I wouldn't. Yet you eventually married," Eleanor pointed out. 10 years later, yes. Charlotte was kind, gentle, patient with a broken man. We had a daughter, Catherine." A shadow crossed his face. "I lost them both to consumption in 93. Catherine was just 10 years old." "I'm sorry for your loss," Eleanor said sincerely. "As am I for yours. I read about James's passing last year, and of course, Lily's death when you were just a child." He shook his head. "Life deals cruel hands, Miss Caldwell." Eleanor fidgeted with her untouched glass. "Mr. Blackwood, about what happened in the ballroom. The shadows." Yes." He leaned forward. "They began appearing shortly after I decided to reopen the manor for this year's autumn ball. Always the same scene. 2 figures dancing while a third watches. At first I thought I was imagining things, a product of grief and isolation. But then the servants began to report similar sightings. Have you any idea what it means?" I believe the manor is trying to right a wrong from the past, a wrong involving your mother, myself, and—" He hesitated. "And my father?" Eleanor suggested. Mr. Blackwood's expression darkened. "Not your father, no." Before he could elaborate, the door burst open. Vivian stood there, face flushed with anger or exertion or both. "Eleanor, I've been searching everywhere for you." Her gaze darted between her niece and their host. "What is the meaning of this, Richard? Sequestering my niece away from the ball?" Miss Caldwell was expressing interest in the pianoforte. He replied smoothly, rising to his feet. "I was sharing its history. Well, I'm afraid we must be leaving. Lord Pembroke has offered us the use of his carriage, as ours has been delayed by the weather." Vivian's tone brooked no argument. "Of course," Richard conceded, "though I hope Miss Caldwell might return tomorrow afternoon. There's a matter of some family history I'd like to discuss further." "That won't be possible," Vivian said firmly. "We're departing for London first thing in the morning. Come, Eleanor." Eleanor stood, setting her untouched drink aside. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Blackwood." On impulse, she added, "Perhaps I might write to you regarding our discussion." A flicker of hope crossed his face. "I would welcome your correspondence, Miss Caldwell." Vivian practically dragged Eleanor from the room. As they hurried through the corridors toward the entrance hall, Eleanor attempted to question her aunt, but Vivian silenced her with a sharp, "Not here." They collected their wraps from a footman and waited in the entrance hall for their carriage to be brought round. Eleanor noticed William descending the grand staircase and caught his eye. He altered his course to approach them. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Caldwell." He greeted them with a bow. "Are you departing so soon?" "Yes, Dr. Hargrove," Vivian answered tersely. "How is Mrs. Lancaster?" "Resting comfortably. A mild case of asthma, exacerbated by the dampness." His eyes met Eleanor's. "Miss Caldwell, might I call upon you tomorrow? There's a matter I wish to discuss further." Before Vivian could object, Eleanor replied, "I would welcome your visit, Doctor, though I understand you're quite busy with your practice." "Never too busy for matters of importance," he assured her with a meaningful look. Their carriage was announced, and Eleanor was once again whisked away by her aunt. The journey home passed in tense silence, broken only when they were safely inside their own dwelling. "You will not receive Dr. Hargrove tomorrow," Vivian declared as she removed her cloak. "And you will certainly not correspond with Richard Blackwood." "Aunt Vivian, I don't understand." "You were the one who introduced me to Dr. Hargrove, and you were clearly on friendly terms with Mr. Blackwood when we arrived. That was before I realized his intentions." Vivian paced the parlor, agitated in a way Eleanor had never witnessed. "Richard has obviously formed some fixation on you due to your resemblance to your mother. He told me they were engaged," Eleanor said, "that she broke it off to marry my father." Vivian froze. "He had no right to share such things with you." "Why not?" "It concerns my family, my history." "Because it's more complicated than he knows," Vivian burst out, then immediately pressed her hand to her mouth, as though trying to recapture the words. Eleanor approached her aunt slowly. "What don't I know, Aunt Vivian? Please, I deserve the truth." Vivian sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of her 58 years. "Sit down, Eleanor. This is not a conversation I ever wish to have with you." Eleanor obeyed, perching on the edge of the settee opposite her aunt. "Your mother and Richard Blackwood were indeed engaged, unofficially," Vivian began, her voice low. "Their families approved of the match, and the announcement was to be made at the autumn ball of 1883. But a week before the ball, Lily discovered she was with child." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Richard's child?" "Yes. She confided in me, terrified of the scandal it would cause. I suggested she tell Richard immediately, that they move up the wedding. But Lily was afraid. The Blackwoods were strict and traditional. She feared Richard would reject her, that his family would disown him if they married under such circumstances. So she married my father instead," Eleanor whispered, the pieces falling into place. "A man wealthy enough and old enough that no one would question a hasty wedding or a premature birth." Vivian nodded sadly. James had been pursuing Lily for months. He agreed to the arrangement with the understanding that the child would be raised as his own. "Then my father, my real father, is Richard Blackwood." The words felt strange on Eleanor's tongue, as though she were speaking a foreign language. "Yes, though James came to love you as his own, he never treated you with anything less than complete devotion." Eleanor stood abruptly, needing to move, to process this revelation. "Does Mr. Blackwood, does Richard know?" "No," Lily made me promise never to tell anyone. She believed it would be cruel to Richard to know he had a child he could never claim, and as the years passed it seemed kinder to maintain the secret. Kinder? Eleanor's voice rose. You've kept me from my true father for 20 years, and you call that kind? I kept a promise to my dying sister, Vivian replied, her own voice hardening. Lily extracted that vow from me on her deathbed. Would you have had me break it? I would have had the truth. And what good would it have done? Would it have brought Lily back? Would it have changed your upbringing? James gave you everything. Education, comfort, social position. But not identity, Eleanor countered. Not heritage. Not the truth of who I am. Vivian rose, crossing to place her hands on Eleanor's shoulders. You are Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of James and Lily Caldwell. That is your identity, regardless of whose blood runs in your veins. Eleanor pulled away. I need time to think, to understand what this means. Of course, but please, Eleanor, be cautious. Richard Blackwood is not the man he once was. Grief and isolation have changed him, as they would anyone. Eleanor defended him automatically, then realized she was already feeling protective of the man she'd just discovered was her father. She retired to her chamber, though sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with questions, with fragments of conversations from earlier in the evening, the shadows in the ballroom, the pianoforte with her mother's initials, Mr. Blackwood, her father, saying the manor was trying to right a wrong. As dawn broke, Eleanor made her decision. She dressed simply in a walking costume of forest green, pinned up her hair, and packed a small valise with essentials. She penned a brief note to her aunt, explaining that she needed time away to process everything, and promising to send word of her whereabouts once she was settled. The household was still quiet as she slipped out the back door and began the walk into the village. Her plan was straightforward: find temporary lodgings, then send a message to Blackwood Manor requesting a meeting with its master. The village was just stirring as she arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors, delivery boys making their morning rounds. Eleanor realized she hadn't thought through the practicalities of her situation. As a young woman alone, finding respectable accommodations might prove challenging. Miss Caldwell? She turned to find William Hargrove approaching, medical bag in hand. He looked as though he'd been up all night, his collar slightly askew, his copper hair tousled. Dr. Hargrove, you're abroad early. A difficult birth at the Miller's house, he explained. Mother and child are doing well now. He studied her appearance, the valise, the travel attire. You seem prepared for a journey. I thought your aunt mentioned London. Change of plans, Eleanor said vaguely. I find I have business here that requires my attention. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You've learned the truth. Part of it, at least. She glanced around the increasingly busy street. Dr. Hargrove, might I impose upon you for a moment of your time? Somewhere more private. Of course, my office is just there. He gestured to a modest building across the square. The housekeeper won't arrive for another hour, but I can offer you tea and discretion. His office was neat and plainly furnished with a small waiting area that opened into an examination room. Beyond that, Eleanor glimpsed what appeared to be private quarters. Please sit, William invited, indicating a chair in the waiting area. I'll put the kettle on. While he busied himself with the tea things, Eleanor gathered her thoughts. When he returned with 2 steaming cups, she accepted one gratefully. You knew, didn't you? She asked without preamble. About Mr. Blackwood being my father. William settled into the chair opposite her. I suspected. There have been rumors in the village for years about your mother and Richard Blackwood. When I saw you together last night, the resemblance was unmistakable. Something in the set of your jaw, the shape of your eyes. Why didn't you say something during our dance? Or in the music room? It wasn't my place. He sipped his tea. Besides, such revelations should come from family, not from a near stranger with an interest in local gossip. Eleanor studied him over the rim of her cup. Is that all it is to you? Gossip? No, he admitted. My interest is more personal. You see, the story of Richard Blackwood and Lily Montgomery has always been intertwined with my own family's history. My grandmother was engaged to Thomas Blackwood before she broke it off to marry my grandfather. The Hargroves and the Blackwoods have a complicated relationship spanning generations. And what of the shadows? Do you have an explanation for those as well? William set his cup down. I have a theory. The night of the autumn ball in 1883, the one that never took place, something happened at Blackwood Manor. Something beyond Lily's broken engagement. What do you mean? According to local legend, a young woman was either killed or disappeared that night. Some versions of the story claim she was in love with Thomas Blackwood and took her own life when she learned he would never leave his wife. Others suggest foul play. But what does that have to do with the three shadows we saw? I believe the third shadow belongs to that woman, or her spirit, if you will, and I think her fate is somehow connected to your mother's decision to marry James Caldwell instead of Richard Blackwood. Eleanor shook her head. This is all so fantastical. Says the woman who saw three shadows cast by two people, William remarked with a gentle smile. Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. Fair point, Doctor. She sobered quickly. I intend to go to Blackwood Manor today to speak with Richard, to learn the full truth. Then I'm coming with you, William said firmly. That's not necessary. I can manage on my own. I'm sure you can, but I have questions of my own, and I don't entirely trust Richard Blackwood in his current state of mind. Besides, he added with a touch of humor, what would your aunt say if she discovered I'd allowed you to visit a gentleman's home unchaperoned? My aunt will have plenty to say regardless of what I do today, Eleanor replied dryly. But very well, if you insist on playing the gentleman. I insist on ensuring your safety, he corrected. There's a difference. They finished their tea, and William excused himself to change his attire and leave instructions for his assistant regarding the day's appointments. When he returned, he wore a fresh suit and had arranged for a trap to take them to Blackwood Manor. The journey passed mostly in contemplative silence. Eleanor watched the landscape roll by, autumn colors muted by the overcast sky. Occasionally, William would point out a landmark or share a brief anecdote about the area, clearly attempting to lighten the mood. Blackwood Manor appeared even more imposing in daylight. Without the softening effect of lamplight and music, its decay was more evident. Crumbling stonework, neglected gardens, windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. A servant answered their knock, clearly surprised by visitors so early in the day. When Eleanor gave her name, however, his demeanor changed immediately. Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might call Miss Caldwell. Please, come this way. He's in the library. As they followed the servant through the manor, Eleanor noticed details she'd missed the previous night. Water stains on some ceilings, threadbare spots in the carpets, gaps where valuable items had once stood on display pedestals. The library was a vast room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. A fire burned in the grate, providing the only warmth in the otherwise chilly space. Richard Blackwood stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames. He turned as they entered, surprise registering on his face at the sight of William. Miss Caldwell, Dr. Hargrove. He greeted them with a slight bow. This is unexpected. I thought your aunt had insisted on your departure for London. She did, Eleanor confirmed. I chose otherwise. Richard gestured to a seating area near the fire. Please join me. Parker, bring tea for our guests. Once the servant had departed and they were seated, Richard fixed his gaze on Eleanor. I presume you've had an illuminating conversation with your aunt since we last spoke. Yes, Eleanor said simply. She told me everything. His eyebrows rose. Everything? I find that difficult to believe, considering Vivian Whitmore has spent 20 years guarding her secrets. She told me you're my father, Eleanor clarified, that my mother was carrying your child when she married James Caldwell. Richard's composure faltered. He gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. That cannot be true. I assure you it is, Eleanor said gently. Aunt Vivian had no reason to lie about such a thing, especially when the revelation clearly distressed her. Lily was with child? My child? Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. And she never told me? She feared rejection, from you, from your family. The scandal would have been considerable. Richard rose abruptly, pacing before the fire. Rejection? From me? I would have moved heaven and earth for her. For you. He stopped, staring at Eleanor as though truly seeing her for the first time. My daughter. All these years. His voice broke. I should have known. The moment I saw you last night, something in me recognized you. Eleanor felt tears prickling behind her eyes. I felt it too. A connection I couldn't explain. William, who had remained silent during this exchange, cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwood, while this reunion is undoubtedly significant, we mustn't forget the other matter that brought us here. Richard turned his attention to the young doctor. Yes, Dr. Hargrove, the shadows. I presume Miss Caldwell has shared our experience with you. She has, and I believe they may be connected to another event, one that supposedly occurred the night of the canceled autumn ball in 1883. Richard's expression hardened. You refer to Regina Watson, the woman who disappeared, William confirmed, or died. depending on the version of the story one hears. It was neither, Richard said grimly. She left Ravenshire County of her own volition that night. I helped her go. Eleanor and William exchanged startled glances. Perhaps you should start from the beginning, Eleanor suggested. Richard resumed his seat, his movements suddenly those of a much older man. Regina Watson was a distant cousin of my mother's, invited to stay with us that summer. She was beautiful, vivacious, and obsessively in love with my father. But he was married to your mother, Eleanor said, confused. Yes, not that it deterred Regina. She pursued him relentlessly, convinced he would leave my mother for her if only given enough encouragement. Richard's lip curled in distaste. My father was not entirely blameless. He enjoyed the attention, though I don't believe he ever intended to act upon it. What happened the night of the ball? William pressed. I discovered Regina in my father's study, going through his personal correspondence. She had found letters from Lily to me, passionate, private communications between two people in love. Regina threatened to make them public, to create a scandal that would destroy Lily's reputation. Why would she do such a thing? Eleanor asked. She believed it would distract from her own indiscretions with my father, and perhaps she simply enjoyed wielding power over others. Richard sighed heavily. I confronted her. We argued. She became hysterical, threatening not only Lily's reputation but her physical safety as well. So you helped her leave, William concluded. I gave her money and arranged transportation to Liverpool, where she could board a ship to America. In return, she promised to leave quietly and never contact my family again. Richard stared into the fire. I never told anyone, not even my parents. They assumed she had simply grown tired of country life and departed on her own. But the rumors began nonetheless, William noted. People will always find ways to embellish the truth. A young woman vanishes the very night a grand ball is mysteriously cancelled. It was too tempting for the local gossips to resist. Eleanor tried to process this new information. So the third shadow, you believe it's Regina Watson? I don't know, Richard admitted. But the timing of these manifestations, coinciding with my decision to reinstate the autumn ball after all these years, cannot be mere coincidence. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. In that moment, Eleanor noticed something odd about the flames. They seemed to form a pattern, almost like a woman's silhouette. Look, she whispered, pointing. Both men turned toward the fireplace. The flame figure grew more distinct, raising what appeared to be an arm toward them, before collapsing back into ordinary fire. Good God, William muttered. Richard stood, approaching the fireplace cautiously. Regina? He called, his voice uncertain. Is that you? No response came from the flames, but a sudden cold draft swept through the room, causing the fire to gutter momentarily. She's here, Richard said with conviction. Somewhere in the manor. Mr. Blackwood, William began, his tone that of a physician addressing an unstable patient. Perhaps we should— I'm not mad, Dr. Hargrove, Richard interrupted sharply. I know what I saw, what we all saw. Regina Watson has returned to Blackwood Manor, and I intend to discover why. Eleanor rose to stand beside her newly discovered father. I believe you. After what we witnessed in the ballroom last night, how can I not? Richard gave her a grateful look. Thank you, my dear. So what do we do now? William asked, joining them by the fire. We search for answers, Richard declared. Starting with this. He crossed to a bookshelf, removing a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. I found this among my father's possessions after his death. I never knew what it contained, as it requires a key I've never located. He handed the box to Eleanor. It was heavier than its size suggested, with intricate carvings along the edges and a small ornate keyhole at the center of the front panel. Why show this to us now? She asked, turning the box in her hands. Because last night, after you departed, I found this. From his pocket, Richard produced a tiny silver key on a delicate chain. It was on the floor of the ballroom, exactly where you and Dr. Hargrove were dancing when the shadows appeared. William leaned closer to examine the key. It looks like it might fit. Eleanor placed the box on a nearby table, and Richard handed her the key. With trembling fingers, she inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the lid of the box sprang open a fraction of an inch. Go on, Richard urged. Eleanor lifted the lid fully. Inside lay several items. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small velvet pouch, a pressed flower preserved between sheets of waxed paper, and a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. Richard reached for the photograph with reverent hands. It showed a young woman in early 1880s attire, her expression serious yet with a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Regina," he confirmed, passing the image to Eleanor. "Taken during her stay here." Eleanor studied the face. Beautiful indeed, with high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that seemed to challenge the viewer even through the static medium of photography. She handed it to William, who frowned as he examined it. "There's something familiar about her," he mused, "though I can't quite place it." Richard had moved on to the letters, scanning the topmost one with increasing agitation. "These are not from Regina to my father, as I would have expected. They're from my father to Regina." "What do they say?" Eleanor asked. "They confirm an affair, but there's more." Richard read further, his face paling. "According to this, Regina was with child when she left Ravenshire. My father's child." William set the photograph down. "So she was pregnant when you sent her away?" "If this letter is to be believed, yes, though she never mentioned it to me during our confrontation." Richard continued reading, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "She wrote to him from America, it seems, demanding money for the child's upkeep, threatening to return and expose everything if he didn't comply." "Did he?" Eleanor asked. "Apparently so. The last letter acknowledges receipt of funds and reiterates her promise to remain in America." Richard set the letters aside and reached for the velvet pouch. What else was she hiding? The pouch contained a gold locket, ornately engraved with the initials TB, Thomas Blackwood. When Richard opened it, a lock of dark hair was revealed, secured with a tiny ribbon. "A lover's token," William observed. The final item, the pressed flower, appeared to be a forget-me-not. A small note tucked alongside it read simply, "Remember your promise, R.W." As Richard replaced the items in the box, Eleanor noticed something. A false bottom, slightly ajar. "Wait," she said, pointing. "There's something else." Richard pried up the hidden compartment, revealing a folded sheet of paper yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, scanning its contents before sinking heavily into his chair. "Richard?" Eleanor prompted, concerned by his reaction. "It's a confession," he said hoarsely, "written by my father on his deathbed. Regina Watson didn't go to America. She never left England." "Then where did she go?" William asked. Richard looked up, his eyes haunted. "Nowhere. She never left Blackwood Manor. My father killed her that night." A shocked silence fell over the room. Eleanor found herself instinctively moving closer to William, who placed a steadying hand at her elbow. "But you said you arranged her passage to Liverpool," William reminded Richard. "I did. But according to this, she returned later that night to confront my father one last time," they argued. "She threatened to expose not only his affair with her but also her pregnancy. In his rage, he struck her. She fell, hit her head on the hearth, and died instantly." "My God," Eleanor whispered. "What did he do with her body?" Richard's voice was hollow as he continued. "He buried her in the old well on the east side of the property. It had been dry for years and was sealed over the following spring as part of the garden renovations." William ran a hand through his hair, visibly disturbed. "And he let you believe you'd helped her escape, let you carry that secret all these years, while he carried the true horror alone." Richard refolded the confession. "Until now." The servant returned with tea, oblivious to the tension in the room. They waited in silence until he had departed again. "This explains the shadows," Eleanor said once they were alone. "Regina's spirit is tied to this place, to what happened to her and her unborn child." "But why now?" William questioned. Why, after all these years, would she begin to manifest? The autumn ball, Richard realized. "I've reopened the manor for the first such event since the night she died. And perhaps," he looked at Eleanor with dawning comprehension, "perhaps your presence, the child of Lily and myself, the union that might have been announced that night, has disturbed whatever uneasy rest she's found. We need to help her," Eleanor declared, "to give her and her child a proper burial, proper recognition." "I agree," Richard said. "We'll excavate the old well site immediately." "This is madness," William protested, "based on a letter that could easily be a fiction, a product of your father's guilty conscience or failing mind." "Then how do you explain the shadows?" Eleanor challenged. "The figure in the flames? The key appearing precisely where we danced?" William had no answer for that. "I'll summon my groundskeeper," Richard decided, tugging the bell pull. "We'll begin at once." While they waited, Eleanor approached the window, gazing out at the gloomy landscape. The rain had started again, a fine mist that shrouded the estate in ghostly veils. Movement caught her eye. A woman in white, walking slowly among the rose bushes despite the inclement weather. "Richard," she called urgently. "There's someone in the garden." Both men joined her at the window. The figure had stopped, turning to look directly at the library window. Even from this distance, Eleanor recognized the face from the daguerreotype. "Regina," Richard breathed. Without another word, all three rushed from the library, through the manor, and out into the gardens. The rain had intensified, soaking them instantly, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the spot where they had seen the woman. No one was there. "She was right here," Eleanor insisted, spinning in a circle as if the ghost might materialize again. "I saw her clearly." "As did I," Richard confirmed, equally bewildered by the disappearance. William, ever practical, examined the ground. "There are no footprints except our own. The soil is soft from the rain. Anyone walking here would leave tracks." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept up Eleanor's spine. "She's leading us somewhere." As if in response to her words, a faint glow appeared further along the path, near an overgrown section of the garden where stone benches surrounded what appeared to be a decorative circular paving. The old well. Richard identified it, already striding in that direction. The glow intensified as they approached, hovering directly over the center of the stone circle. Up close, Eleanor could see that what she had taken for decorative paving was actually a large stone slab with the blackwood crest carved into its center. "This is it," Richard confirmed grimly. The well was here. The groundskeeper arrived with several laborers, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and trepidation as Richard explained what needed to be done. It took 6 men with pry bars to lift the massive stone slab, revealing a dark shaft that descended into the earth. The smell that rose from the opening was dank and musty, the air undisturbed for decades. "Lower a lantern," Richard ordered. The groundskeeper obeyed, attaching an oil lantern to a long rope and carefully lowering it into the shaft. The light revealed rough stone walls descending about 30 feet before opening into a wider chamber, the bottom of the old well. "I can see something," the groundskeeper reported, peering into the depths. "Looks like cloth maybe, and something white. Could be bone." Richard's face was ashen. "Prepare to recover whatever remains are down there, and send for the constable. This is a matter for the authorities now." Eleanor felt William's hand close around hers, offering silent support. She squeezed it gratefully, unable to tear her gaze from the open well and the secrets it had held for so long. The recovery was a grim business. Eleanor and William retreated to the house while Richard remained to oversee the work. Hours passed as they waited in the library, speaking little, both lost in their own thoughts. When Richard finally returned, his clothes were muddied and his expression haunted. "It's done. They found her remains, just as my father described. The constable has taken custody of everything. There will be an investigation, of course, though it's unlikely to result in much after all this time." "What will happen to her?" Eleanor asked softly. "I've arranged for a proper burial in the village churchyard. Anonymous for now, until we know more." Richard sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "They also found the remains of her child, unborn, as my father wrote." William, who had been silent, finally spoke. "There's still something we're missing. If Regina's spirit has been at rest all these years, why manifest now? Why lead us to her remains after decades of silence?" As if in answer, a cold draft swept through the room, strong enough to extinguish the fire. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the sudden chill. A form took shape near the fireplace, insubstantial at first, then gradually solidifying into the figure of a woman in an outdated dress. Regina Watson. Eleanor gasped, pressing back against the sofa. William moved protectively in front of her, while Richard rose to face the apparition. "Regina," he addressed the spirit, his voice remarkably steady. "We've found you. We know what my father did. Justice will be done, I promise you." The ghost regarded him impassively, then turned her gaze to William. Her expression changed, softened somehow, before she looked toward Eleanor. One spectral hand rose, pointing directly at her. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor whispered. Regina's lips moved, but no sound emerged. She gestured more urgently, first at Eleanor, then at William, then at Richard. "I don't understand," Richard said, frustration evident in his tone. The ghost seemed equally frustrated. She moved suddenly, gliding across the room to a writing desk. With visible effort, she managed to knock a pen to the floor. "She wants to communicate," William realized. "Perhaps if we provide paper." Eleanor quickly placed a sheet of paper on the desk, along with the fallen pen. Regina concentrated, her form flickering as she attempted to interact with the physical objects. The pen moved jerkily across the paper, leaving faint marks, not words, but a simple drawing. 3 figures standing together, the 3 shadows. Eleanor breathed. Regina nodded, then continued her crude drawing, adding what appeared to be a family tree. At the top, she placed 2 names, Thomas Blackwood and Regina Watson. Below them, a single name, Margaret Watson. William leaned closer, studying the drawing. Margaret Watson? Your child? The ghost nodded again, then drew a line connecting Margaret to another name, Harold Hargrove. The color drained from William's face. Harold Hargrove was my grandfather. Regina pointed emphatically at William, then at the connection on the paper. My grandfather married Margaret Watson, William said slowly, piecing it together. Which means Margaret was Regina's daughter with my father. Richard completed the thought. Your grandmother. Eleanor looked between the 2 men, seeing the implications dawn on their faces. Then you're related. Richard, William is your nephew, half-nephew, grandnephew technically, William corrected, still visibly shaken. If Margaret was Thomas's daughter and she was my grandmother, then Richard is my great-uncle. Regina nodded vigorously, seemingly pleased they had understood. She turned her attention to Eleanor, pointing at her, then at Richard, then drawing another connection on the paper. Yes, Richard is my father, Eleanor confirmed. The ghost completed her drawing, connecting William and Eleanor with a line, then looking up expectantly. William frowned. I don't understand. What is she trying to tell us? Eleanor studied the crude family tree, the connections between them all. She's showing us how we're all connected. Richard and I by blood, you and Richard by blood, and you and I, not by blood, William realized, but still connected somehow. Regina's form began to fade, her energy apparently waning. As she diminished, she pointed one last time at the line connecting William and Eleanor, her expression almost pleading. Wait, Richard called. What do you want us to do? But the ghost was gone, leaving only a lingering chill in the paper with its cryptic drawing. The 3 of them stared at the sheet in silence, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. My grandmother was Margaret Watson, William said eventually. She died when I was very young. I barely remember her. And she never mentioned her mother? Or her true father? Richard asked. Not to me. Though this explains why my grandmother was always so interested in Blackwood Manor, why she told so many stories about it. William ran a hand through his hair. She must have known or suspected the truth. But what does Regina want from us? Eleanor persisted. Why show us these connections now? Perhaps she simply wants acknowledgement, Richard suggested. Recognition of the truth after all these years of secrets. William shook his head. I think it's more than that. The way she pointed at the connection between Eleanor and me, she wants something specific. Eleanor studied the drawing again, then looked up suddenly as understanding dawned. The 3 shadows in the ballroom, they weren't just you and me, William. They were all 3 of us. You, me, and Regina, dancing together. The dance that never happened, Richard said softly. The night everything changed for all our families. That's it, Eleanor declared, conviction in her voice. She wants us to complete the dance, to publicly acknowledge all the connections, all the truths that have been hidden, to right the wrongs of the past. How? The autumn ball is over, William pointed out. We'll hold another, Richard decided. Tomorrow night, a special gathering to honor Regina and her child, to acknowledge the truth that have been concealed for too long. And we'll dance, Eleanor added. The 3 of us, just as she's shown us, completing what was interrupted all those years ago. The following evening, Blackwood Manor was once again illuminated, though with a more subdued elegance than the previous ball. Fewer guests had been invited, only those with connections to the families involved, plus a handful of village dignitaries and the local vicar. The story had spread quickly, as such stories do in small communities. The discovery of Regina Watson's remains, Thomas Blackwood's confession, the revelation of Eleanor's true parentage, all had become common knowledge in a matter of hours. Most shocking to the local gossips was the connection between the Hargroves and the Blackwoods, the realization that William was, in fact, Richard's grandnephew. Eleanor prepared for the evening in the same guest chamber she had used 2 nights before, though with very different emotions. Aunt Vivian had refused to attend, declaring the whole affair morbid and inappropriate, but had reluctantly accepted Eleanor's decision to acknowledge Richard as her father. Her gown tonight was silver gray, like moonlight on water, adorned with subtle beading that caught the light as she moved. Her hair was arranged more simply than before, with a single pearl comb as her only ornament. A soft knock at the door announced William's arrival. He entered at her invitation, resplendent in formal evening attire, a small box in his hands. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." Eleanor smiled, noting how different their interaction felt now, weighted with all they had discovered. "Is everything prepared?" "Yes. The guests are arriving and Richard is greeting them in the entrance hall." He approached, opening the box to reveal a delicate bracelet of silver filigree. "This belonged to my grandmother, to Margaret. I thought you might wear it tonight, as a symbol of our connected histories." Eleanor extended her wrist, allowing him to fasten the bracelet. "It's lovely. Thank you." His fingers lingered on her wrist a moment longer than necessary. "Eleanor, regardless of what happens tonight, I want you to know that my interest in you, my admiration, began before I knew of any connection between our families." She met his gaze steadily. "As did mine for you." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when the distant sound of the front door chimes announced more arrivals. "We should join the others," William said reluctantly. Eleanor took his offered arm, and together they descended to the entrance hall, where Richard waited. He had aged visibly in the past 2 days, the weight of revelations and responsibilities etching new lines in his face. Yet there was also a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. The peace of a man finally confronting long-buried truths. "My dear," he greeted Eleanor, kissing her cheek. "And William, are you both prepared for this evening's unusual proceedings?" "As prepared as we can be," William replied, "though I'm still not entirely convinced this will work." "It will," Eleanor said with quiet confidence. "I can feel it." The gathering was modest but dignified. In the drawing room, Richard had arranged for a small memorial to Regina and her unborn child. A simple display of white flowers, candles, and the daguerreotype from the hidden box. Guests paused before it, murmuring respectfully before moving on to the refreshments. At precisely 9 o'clock, Richard called for attention. The guests assembled in the ballroom, the same space where Eleanor and William had witnessed the 3 shadows. The chamber was illuminated more sparsely than during the autumn ball, creating an atmosphere of solemn expectation rather than festive celebration. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "thank you for joining us on this unusual occasion. As many of you have heard, recent days have brought to light long-buried secrets concerning the Blackwood, Caldwell, and Hargrove families." He proceeded to explain the discoveries: Regina's fate, Eleanor's parentage, the connection to William's grandmother, with dignity and unflinching honesty. The guests listened in respectful silence, occasional murmurs of surprise or sympathy the only interruptions. "Tonight," Richard continued, "we gather not only to acknowledge these truths, but to attempt something that may seem peculiar to those unacquainted with the unusual events that have occurred in this house. My daughter, Eleanor, and my grandnephew, Dr. William Hargrove, will now perform the dance that should have taken place on that fateful night in 1883, the dance that we believe will finally allow Regina Watson's spirit to rest in peace." Whispers rippled through the assembly, but no one objected. The orchestra, reduced to a quartet for this occasion, began to play a waltz popular in the early 1880s. Eleanor and William took their positions in the center of the dance floor, all eyes upon them. As they began to move in time to the music, Eleanor felt an odd sensation, a tingling in her fingertips where they touched William's, a lightness in her steps as if she were being guided by some unseen force. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and a familiar chill crept into the room despite the blazing fireplaces. "It's happening," William whispered, his eyes widening as he gazed past Eleanor's shoulder. "Look at the wall." Eleanor turned her head slightly, maintaining the rhythm of their dance. On the far wall, illuminated by candlelight, 3 shadows moved in perfect unison. Hers, William's, and between them, the unmistakable silhouette of a woman in 1880s attire. Gasps rose from the onlookers as they too noticed the phenomenon. Richard stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Regina," he addressed the 3rd shadow, "we acknowledge you. We honor the truth of what happened to you and your child. We recognize the connections between our families, connections formed in tragedy, but which might now, perhaps, lead to healing." The 3rd shadow seemed to grow more substantial. Eleanor felt a presence between her and William, as tangible as if a 3rd person had joined their dance. The music swelled, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she glimpsed a woman's face, serene, grateful, at peace, before the shadow detached itself from their dance. It moved gracefully across the wall, pausing before Richard. He bowed deeply to it, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The shadow seemed to curtsy in return before continuing on, growing fainter with each passing moment until it reached the French doors leading to the terrace. There it lingered briefly, turning back as if to look once more at the assembled company. Then, like mist in morning sunlight, it dissolved and was gone. The music faded to silence. No one spoke for several long moments, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I believe," he said softly, "that Regina has found her peace." The remainder of the evening passed in a curious mixture of solemnity and celebration. The orchestra resumed playing, and gradually, guests began to dance, though with a reverent quality to their movements, as if aware they were participating in something more significant than a social gathering. Eleanor and William stepped out onto the terrace, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across a velvet sky. The storm that had persisted for days had finally broken. "Do you think she's truly at rest now?" Eleanor asked, gazing up at the constellations. "I believe so," William replied, "though I suspect her presence will always be felt here in some way, not as a haunting, but as a part of the manor's history, of our family's history." Eleanor turned to face him, struck by his use of "our family." "It's strange, isn't it? 3 days ago we were strangers. Now we're bound together by revelations that span generations." "Not entirely strangers," he corrected with a small smile. "I'd admired you from afar for some time before your aunt's introduction." "Had you indeed?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You concealed it well. A doctor learns to maintain a professional demeanor." His expression grew more serious. "Eleanor, I know this is all very sudden and you've had a great deal to process, but I wonder if you might permit me to call on you properly once the dust has settled. Not as a distant relation, but as a man who finds himself increasingly captivated by a remarkable woman." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her despite the cool night air. "I think I might be amenable to such an arrangement, Dr. Hargrove." "William, please. I think we've moved well beyond formalities." "William," she agreed softly. Inside, the orchestra began a new piece, a slower, more romantic melody that drifted out to them through the open doors. "Would you care to dance, Eleanor?" William asked, offering his hand. "Just the two of us this time." She placed her hand in his. "I'd like that very much." As they moved together beneath the stars, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 nights ago, she had been Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of James and Lily, attending her first society ball. Now she was Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of Richard Blackwood and Lily Montgomery, dancing in the arms of a man who was, by some complex genealogical calculation, a distant cousin, yet felt like the beginning of something entirely new. From the doorway, Richard watched them, a bittersweet smile on his face. So much had been lost. Years he could never reclaim with his daughter, a love with Lily that had never had the chance to fully bloom. Yet something had been gained as well. Truth, connection, the possibility of a new family forged from the fragments of the old. As Eleanor and William continued their dance, 3 shadows stretched across the terrace stones, their own, and between them, barely perceptible but undeniably present, the faint outline of a third figure, no longer restless, no longer seeking justice, but offering what might almost be interpreted as a blessing. Blackwood Manor would always carry its secrets, its sorrows, its shadows. But from this night forward, it would also carry hope, the hope that even the most tangled histories could, with truth and acknowledgement, find their way toward light. And in the pale glow of moonlight, dust particles danced like specters through the air, witnesses to the end of one story and the beginning of another.